It was an unusually quiet afternoon at the Pinewood police station. The rhythmic tapping of fingers on keyboards and the faint hum of a vending machine filled the air, a stark contrast to the usual buzz of reports and phone calls. Officer Karen Reed leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the small town was bathed in the golden light of a late summer day, the kind of day that made everyone a little slower, a little lazier. Suddenly, a commotion broke the monotony. The heavy glass door at the front of the station slammed open, startling everyone inside. Officer Reed instinctively reached for her holster, but froze mid-motion when she saw the intruder, a dog. Not just any dog, a scruffy, mud-covered shepherd mix with wild, desperate eyes and a heaving chest. It stumbled over its own legs, its paws slipping on the polished floor as it struggled to stand upright. The dog was panting so hard it seemed like it might collapse any second. "What on earth?" Karen whispered to herself as she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. The dog staggered a few more steps into the station, its body trembling with exhaustion. It looked around wildly, as if searching for someone or something. There was something in its eyes, something urgent, almost human in its desperation. Karen felt a strange pang in her chest, an instinctive pull, like the dog was trying to say something it couldn't put into words. "Hey, buddy," Karen said softly, taking a cautious step forward. The other officers in the room had stopped what they were doing, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected visitor. "What's wrong, huh? What's got you all worked up?" The dog didn't respond. Of course it didn't, but it didn't back away either. Instead, it barked, a sharp, hoarse sound that echoed through the station. Then it turned toward the door, looking back at Karen as if to say, "Follow me." "Is this for real?" one of the officers muttered, chuckling nervously. But Karen wasn't laughing. There was something about this dog, something more than its ragged appearance or its erratic behavior. This wasn't just a lost pet. This was a call for help. The dog barked again, more insistent this time, before trotting toward the door. It paused, looking back to make sure Karen was following. She hesitated for only a moment before grabbing her radio and keys. "Stay here," she called to the others. "I'm going to check this out." "Are you serious?" one of them asked, raising an eyebrow. "Dead serious," Karen replied, already halfway out the door. As soon as she stepped outside, the dog took off, its tired legs pushing it forward with surprising determination. Karen followed, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. The town was eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The dog darted through the streets, weaving between parked cars and cutting across sidewalks. It wasn't moving aimlessly. This was deliberate. It knew exactly where it was going. Karen's radio crackled to life as she jogged after the animal. "Karen, what's going on?" a voice asked. "I don't know yet," she replied, her breath coming in short bursts. "But I think this dog is leading me somewhere. I'll keep you updated." The chase continued for what felt like miles, though it was probably only a few blocks. Karen's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Who did this dog belong to? Why had it come to the station? And most importantly, what or who was it trying to lead her to? Finally, the dog slowed down, its legs trembling with the effort. It stopped in front of a narrow alleyway, its nose pointing toward the dark space between two buildings. Karen approached cautiously, her hand instinctively resting on her holster. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog barked again, its tail wagging weakly, urging her forward. Karen peered into the alley, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and garbage bins. But then there, a movement, a sound, the faintest cry for help. Her stomach tightened. She reached for her flashlight, her instincts screaming at her to be prepared for anything. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, she saw it. A figure slumped against the wall, barely conscious. A man, bruised and battered, his clothes torn and stained with blood. He looked up weakly, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of relief and despair. "Help," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for her radio. "This is Officer Reed," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "I need backup and an ambulance at my location immediately. I've got a man down, possibly injured." The dog barked again, as if to say, "Hurry." Karen dropped to her knees beside the man, her training kicking in as she checked his pulse and assessed his injuries. He was alive, but just barely. She glanced at the dog, which had collapsed onto the ground nearby, its chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "You saved him," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. The dog's eyes met hers for a moment before it closed them, exhausted but content. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something about this scene didn't sit right with her. Something bigger was at play, and she was determined to find out what it was. The quiet town of Pinewood had seen its share of oddities, but this was something else entirely. Karen stood at the entrance of the alley, her flashlight illuminating the bruised and battered man slumped against the wall. As the distant sound of sirens approached, She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. The dog, the man, and the urgency in it all. Something didn't add up. The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics rushing to stabilize the man. His injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. As they worked, Karen turned her attention back to the dog, which had collapsed in the corner, too exhausted to move. She knelt down, gently scratching its ears. "You're a hero, aren't you?" she murmured. The dog's tail wagged faintly, but its eyes remained closed. As the paramedics loaded the injured man onto a stretcher, Karen asked, "Does he have any ID?" One of the medics shook his head. "Nothing. Just a few scraps of paper in his pocket. Looks like a name, maybe an address, but it's smeared with blood." Karen's brow furrowed as she took the papers and examined them. The name Evan was barely legible, scrawled in shaky handwriting. The address, while mostly intact, pointed to a part of town that wasn't exactly known for its charm. It was a derelict neighborhood on the outskirts of Pinewood, a place riddled with abandoned houses and whispered rumors. Back at the station, Karen couldn't focus. The dog's desperate arrival and the injured man's condition gnawed at her mind. The other officers, though intrigued, seemed content to let the medics handle it. But Karen couldn't let it go. The way the dog had stormed in, like it knew the station was its last hope, wasn't something she could ignore. "I'm taking a drive," she announced, grabbing her jacket and the crumpled address from her desk. "You're not seriously going to that neighborhood alone, are you?" one of the officers asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'll take backup if I need it," Karen said. "But something about this feels off. I need to see it for myself." She didn't wait for an answer. Grabbing the leash from the station storage, normally used for stray animals, she attached it to the dog's collar. It was weak, but when she mentioned the address, its ears perked up and it pulled her toward the car. "This is crazy," Karen muttered under her breath as she drove. The dog sat in the passenger seat, its head resting on the dashboard, its eyes fixed on the road ahead. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that the animal understood far more than it should. The address led her to a dilapidated house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The windows were boarded up, the front yard overgrown with weeds. Karen parked the car and turned to the dog. "You're sure about this?" she asked, half expecting an answer. The dog wagged its tail faintly and nudged her arm with its nose. Karen approached the house cautiously, her hand resting on her holster. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She knocked on the door, but the sound echoed hollowly. No one answered. She tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was dark and eerily quiet. The dog tugged on the leash, leading her down a narrow hallway. Karen's flashlight revealed peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and signs that someone had been living there recently. Discarded food wrappers, an old blanket, and a pile of clothes in the corner. The dog stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway, its nose pressed against the crack. Karen took a deep breath and opened it. What she saw made her blood run cold. The small room was filled with photographs pinned to the walls, all of the same man, Evan, the injured man from the alley. Some were candid shots, taken from a distance. Others were close-ups, almost like mugshots. Beneath the photos were scrawled notes, some in neat handwriting, others in frantic, almost illegible script. Words like traitor, thief, and he'll pay jumped out at her. "What the hell is this?" Karen whispered, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The dog growled low in its throat, its fur bristling. Karen turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. A man, thin and gaunt, his eyes wild with paranoia. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice dripping with menace. In his hand, he held a crowbar that Karen's training kicked in. She drew her weapon, keeping it pointed at the ground, but ready to act. "Drop it," she ordered, her voice firm. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "He deserved it. He took everything from me." Karen's mind raced. "You're talking about Evan? The man from the alley?" The man nodded, his expression shifting from anger to anguish. "He ruined my life. I was just trying to get justice." Karen kept her gun trained on him as she reached for her radio. "This is Officer Reed. I need backup at 47 Cedar Lane. Suspect is armed, but contained." The man was taken into custody without incident, but the questions only deepened. As Karen pieced together the fragments of the story, she learned that Evan wasn't just a victim. He was tied to something much larger. The suspect, whose name was revealed to be Paul, claimed Evan had been involved in a scam that left him homeless and desperate. Paul had been stalking Evan for weeks, gathering evidence, plotting his revenge. The dog, as it turned out, belonged to Evan, a loyal companion that had followed him everywhere. But when Paul cornered Evan in the alley, the dog had run for help, its instincts leading it to the police station. Karen couldn't help but marvel at the animal's loyalty and intelligence. It had saved Evan's life, but the case wasn't closed. There were too many loose ends, too many questions about what had really happened between Paul and Evan as she drove back to the station that night. The dog curled up in the passenger seat beside her. Karen knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. Back at the station, Karen sat at her desk, the events of the day replaying in her mind like a fragmented movie. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they didn't quite fit yet. She looked over at the dog, which was now curled up on a blanket an officer had brought. Despite everything it had been through, it seemed content, as if its mission was complete. Karen flipped through the reports she had gathered. Evan was awake and stable at the hospital, but his story was far from clear. He claimed Paul was a deranged man with a grudge, but Paul's notes and photographs suggested otherwise. It was Karen's job to sift through the lies and find the truth. The break came late that night when a background check on Evan revealed a string of aliases. He wasn't just a victim. He was a con artist with a long history of scams, preying on vulnerable people like Paul. The evidence was damning. Forged documents, bank records, and testimonies from past victims that Paul's story began to make sense. He had been one of Evan's marks, lured into a fake investment scheme that wiped out his life savings. Desperate and broken, Paul had followed Evan to Pinewood, hoping to confront him and recover what he had lost. But when the confrontation turned violent, the dog had intervened, saving its owner's life while unknowingly exposing his crimes. The next morning, Karen visited Evan at the hospital. He tried to charm her, insisting he was the real victim, but Karen wasn't buying it. She placed the evidence on the table, watching as his confident facade crumbled. "You've got two choices," she said. "Cooperate and return the money you've stolen, or spend the rest of your life in prison." Evan chose cooperation, though Karen doubted it was out of remorse. Over the following weeks, the stolen funds were tracked down and returned to Paul and other victims. Paul, though still facing charges for the assault, was given a lenient sentence in light of the circumstances. S for the dog. It became an unlikely hero in Pinewood. The local papers ran stories about its loyalty and courage, dubbing it the Miracle Mutt. Evan, now facing justice, relinquished ownership of the dog, and Karen was more than happy to adopt it. She named it Scout, a fitting name for an animal whose instincts and bravery had changed so many lives. One evening, as Karen and Scout walked through the quiet streets of Pinewood, she couldn't help but reflect on how a single moment, a desperate bark at a police station door, had unraveled a web of lies and brought justice to a small town. "Good boy, Scout," she said, scratching behind his ears. Scout wagged his tail, looking up at her with the same determined eyes that had brought him to the station that fateful day. For the first time in what felt like forever, Karen smiled, knowing that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, loyalty and courage could light the way.